Good morning, Countryside. No, that was the last church. Good morning, Cornerstone. So, the interesting thing about being someplace where you preach twice in the same morning is you get to a point where you wonder if you've already said something, in the context that you're doing. Because you've said it before, but you wonder if you've said it before to the people you're talking to. We are so delighted to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to preach to you folks, because you folks are my folks, and it's just a joy to be able to be here and to bring God's word to you. I have, and not only these folks, but the folks that are online. So we welcome the folks that are online, that are tuning in, that will never know that you're there. So if you just go ahead and have a second cup of coffee and slip off the fuzzy slippers and put your feet up and enjoy. We are here following the pattern that we've had. We are looking through the Quest 52 book by Mark Moore, and we're looking at a chapter a week. And this week, we get to deal with the question, what did Jesus say about social justice? Now, when I first was assigned this, I said, wow, that's really cool. I got excited about it because I thought it was something that I'd like to talk about. And until I started looking at what Dr. Moore had written, and then trying to wrap my mind around everything. And what I found, what I discovered is although Dr. Moore uses this title, he never really defines what social justice is. And correct me if I'm wrong, but do we not live in a day and an age where we use terms, and many of us come up with our own definitions because they've never really been declared. They've never really said, well, this is what this is. So we're on our own to gather and glean from the context that these terms are used in, what they really are supposed to mean. And what that does is something unique, in that since there really wasn't a definition in the context of what was written, I get to make up my own definition. But I think it's a definition that'll work for us when I say we understand social justice as resolving perceived inequities between people and people groups. We're looking at trying to make things fair. But I have to say that although we use that definition, when we look at this, in this context, and let me back up just a second to say, Dr. Moore used the term, what did Jesus say about social justice? But then the theme of the chapter itself is about justice. So really what we want to do is not think about what the social context of our world says about justice, but what does God say about justice? And when we think about justice, when we think about social justice, we think about making everything fair, right? We want everybody to get the same amount. When God thinks about social justice, when God thinks about justice, it isn't about being fair, it's about being right. And it's about putting things in their proper place, putting things where they were designed to be. So that's where we're going to, those are the definitions. So that's the context I'm going to work within this morning. Now, if you don't know me, and it is cool. We've been coming to this church since 2017, and some of your faces are familiar. Some of you folks were here before us. Some of you folks have come since we've been here, and some of your faces I'm not sure I've seen before, and that is just so cool, because I have friends I haven't met yet. And if I have met you, I just learned something a couple of weeks ago. My wife and I go to the Y fairly regularly, and I try to get to know people. When I go someplace, I try to get to know people. And I went up to a guy the other day, and I reached out my hand, and I grabbed his hand, and I says, hi, my name's Paul. And he looked me right in the eye and he says, well, hi, Paul, you introduced yourself to me last week. I'm Ken. And I simply looked at him and said, Ken, until I can remember your name, I'm going to keep introducing myself to you. So until I remember your name, I will simply keep introducing myself to you. And if you'll be patient with me, one of these days, I'll know you as well as I know Ken. So, my name, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Paul, and I was called to ministry when I was a teenager. And I missed that calling. I was called, I tried to respond, the response didn't work, so I went off and lived a different life. And I finally received Christ when I was 30 years old. And when I received Christ, that calling was still there because God's calling and His gifts are irrevocable. And I had to begin to try to respond to that and figure out what to do. I was biblically illiterate, but when I became a Christian, I started reading the Bible and I tried to understand what it said. And I went to my pastor and I told my pastor that, here we are. I feel this call to ministry. I don't know quite what to do. And he says, well, we have a process that will get you through. And so I was slated to meet with our conference's ministerial appointments committee on a particular day. And now the Ministerial Appointments Committee were the people that oversaw the pastors in the group of, in the conference, or the group of people, the group of Christians that I was a part of. And so I was scheduled to meet with this board of people. And I got to tell you, I was a bit apprehensive because this was probably 1983 or 84. And at that time, I had long hair and a beard. I know it's hard for you to imagine that, but and at that time, long hair and a beard were not quite as popular as they were today. Because I look around here and I've got fuzzy guys all over the place, and I think that's awesome. But we weren't as popular back then as we are now. And so I was a bit apprehensive knowing that I was going to come before this board of individuals who were going to examine me and make a decision about my future. And to my surprise, I opened up the door to the place where I was to meet these people, and there's a long table, and there's these guys sitting behind it. And it happened to be our denomination's sesquicentennial, so it meant we were 150 years old. And I looked before me, and every guy at the table had an Amish-styled beard. And I said, this is going to go better than I think. And so I went before them, and they started an interview, and they asked me questions about, who I am, where I'm from, who's my people, what's my family, what's my experience, how long have I been a Christian, what do I know? And I answered all those questions as best that I could. And I must let you know that I come from a long line of people that will simply keep talking until we figure out something to say. So it was this next question that really kind of threw me. And there's a bit of embellishment here. I'm just going to tell you that at the beginning, but the embellishment's for your listening pleasure. But they were examining me, and they said, well, have you read the Bible? And I said, well, I'm reading the Bible. I haven't started until I became a Christian. I'm not all the way through it, but I am diligent. I am trying. I am reading. And Dr. Mark, who was the superintendent of a school system, looked at me and he says, well, what's your favorite part of the Bible? And drawing a blank, the first thing that came out of my mouth was the book of parables. And he says, the book of parables. So, well, that's interesting. He says, what's your favorite parable? My favorite parable. Yeah. There was a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and thorns grew up, and they choked him. And the Queen of Sheba came by, and she gave to him 1,000 talents of gold and silver and 100 changes of clothing. And he got into her eunuch's chariot, and they drove furiously, and his hair got caught in a tree, and he hung there many days and many nights. And ravens came along and they brought food for him to eat and water for him to drink. And his wife Delilah came and cut off his hair and he fell onto stony ground. And it began to rain. And it rained 40 days and 40 nights. And he hid in a cave. And someone called out and says, "Come, have supper with me." And he said, "I can't come. I've just married a wife." But he compelled him to come. And later, as he arrived back in Jerusalem, he looked up, and there in the window was that Queen Jezebel. And he saw her, and she saw him, and he laughed. "Throw her on down from there." And they threw her down 70 times, 70 times. And of the fragments, they picked up 12 baskets full. And the question we need to answer is, in the judgment, whose wife will she be? And with that, the board of the Ministerial Appointments Committee, a group of men with Amish-style beards, looked at me silently. And after a moment, they asked me to leave the room. And when I was called back in, they said, "Congratulations. You need some education, but I think we can work with you." God is looking for people that he can work with. God has always been looking for people that he can work with. And this morning, we're going to look at Jesus' first sermon. It is found in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 30. And it starts off like this. He, Jesus, went to Nazareth where he had been brought up. So this is Jesus going to his hometown. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Now, before we get into that, I just want to give us some context for what we're reading here. What I have is a map of a portion of Israel, and on this map you're going to see red lines and yellow lines. Now, the red lines are major roads, the yellow lines are minor roads, and I suspect that Israel is kind of like Virginia, in that there's a whole lot of roads there that didn't make it to the map, because when I drive around here, I drive down Eugene's Road and find myself in a cow pasture someplace, and although I like finding myself in a cow pasture, sometimes I feel a little lost. But these roads indicate what I'm going to call major thoroughfares through Israel. Now, if you look right here, I've circled Nazareth to give you an idea of what the roads around Nazareth, the context around where Jesus was born. Because, friends, most of the time I thought Jesus was born in a little town, maybe there were 14 families, and 100 people, and they had huts and adobe huts and dogs running around and stuff like that. But it appears as though Jesus grew up in a fairly metropolitan area. And not only was it a metropolitan area, it was the crossroads of many of the thoroughfares, the main merchant thoroughfares through Israel. This is, I think they call this the Way of the Sea. And it goes all the way down into Egypt, which would have connected Nazareth, not only with Egypt, but with the whole continent of Africa. And it goes up past Nazareth, and if you follow that around, you'll get into those territories north, but you could continue on into Europe. If you go this way, this will take you off into Turkey and Russia. If you catch this road and come this way, it'll take you to Arabia and Asia. And my point here is that Jesus wasn't, as the quote says, it's wrong to think that Jesus being brought up in a backwater. He was brought up in a town inside of history with traffic of the world almost at his doors. Just the history. If we look in here, this is where a lot of the history of Egypt, or of Israel played out. This is where Saul was anointed. This is where he fought his battles. This is where David met Goliath. This is where Jehu took down Jezebel. So it all happened right on the doorstep of Nazareth. And although Nazareth was kind of in a bowl, or is kind of in a bowl, I'm going to impress Buddy Hearn. Nazareth would be kind of in the Piedmont of this range, this little mountain range. You know what a Piedmont is, right? No. So it's a little plateau, right? So Nazareth would have been in that, and although it was in a bit of a dish, you couldn't see much from Nazareth. If you climbed out into the mountains around it, you could see where all of this history of Israel played out. And this is where Jesus grew up. So he didn't grow up in a backwater separated from everything, but he grew up in the heart of commerce and travel. Here's a road here that would have taken pilgrims from all over here down into Jerusalem as they make that trek where every good Israelite visited Jerusalem, tried to visit Jerusalem at least once a year. This is the context that we have Jesus. This is Jesus not being sequestered in a small little country town, but Jesus being in the heart of travel and commerce. So, as this scroll is handed to Jesus, he opens it, and it says, unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Now this is cool. To read, if you were in the synagogue, everything was read standing up. When someone sat down, they were sitting down to teach. So it's kind of the opposite of what we had here. If this were a synagogue, I'd be seated and you'd be standing up. And so let's try that. No. Sorry. But what this tells us is not only did he read something, his purpose there was to teach. His purpose was to speak. So he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Whoa, this is quite a way to start a sermon. In starting like this, Jesus is making three claims. He says, today this is fulfilled in your presence. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So he's claiming that he is there as a representative of God with his authority and with his power. He's making a claim that the ministry of the Messiah is merciful, not militant. The Israelites of this day believed there were two classes of people in the world. We're talking about social justice, right? We're talking about differentiating between people groups. The people of Israel believed there were two people groups in the world. There was the Israelites and there was everybody else. God favored the Israelites. Everybody else was God's enemy. God was going to uphold the Israelites, and he was going to destroy everybody else. And by claiming that the ministry of the Messiah is mercy, not militancy, Jesus is saying to them, guys, you got it wrong. He's also saying that he embodied the Jubilee. Now, for those of you that don't know, Jubilee was a festival that was supposed to be celebrated every 50th year. It was based on 7 sevens. So 7 times 7 years is 49. So at the end of every 49th year, at the beginning of the 5th year, was supposed to be Jubilee. In Jubilee, all property debts and slavery issues were resolved. If an Israelite had sold property to another, ancestral property to another Israelite, if an Israelite had sold himself into slavery to another Israelite, in Jubilee, that was supposed to be freed. That debt was supposed to be canceled, and those folks were supposed to be free. Jesus is declaring that he is the Jubilee. He is proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. That's what they knew Jubilee to be. Now, this created kind of a buzz in the room. And it says, and all spoke well and were amazed of his gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? They said. And what I think happened, we read this and we read it as if it was a conversation that was going on. But what I think it was a little buzz. As some of you folks are sitting here, I love your rapt attention. But I know sometimes we sit in church and we kind of carry on a conversation with the people next to us. And maybe even sometimes the preacher will say something controversial or where Buzz wants to turn to Tia and go. And I think this is what happened. And they marveled that this guy that they had seen grown up, they had seen him since he was a little guy. They had seen him tagging along with his dad, learning his dad's trade. They had seen him taking care of his family. After his dad passed away, they had seen him grow up into a man. And they were amazed at the way that he spoke. And it started a buzz. And as the buzz is going on, Jesus said to them, surely you'll quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. And you'll tell me, do here in your hometown what we've heard that you did in Capernaum. And so here is my take on what I think he's saying. I think Jesus is saying, you're going to say to me, what's your place? Stay in your lane, Jesus. You're starting to veer out here. Don't point fingers unless you point some back at yourself. And if you're really who you say you are, do the same kind of stuff we hear you've been doing. Let's see you heal somebody. Let's see you speak to a demon, drive a demon out. Let's see what you can do. But he continues, he says this, truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine in the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. He's saying to them, you guys think everything's about you. But when Elijah came, he didn't heal Israelites. He didn't feed Israelites, but he fed one of those people that you don't like very much. And he said, and there were many people in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, and not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman, the Syrian. Second point. Elijah's protege didn't come to the people of Israel either, but he healed one of your enemies. And they just loved him for this. They were so amazed at what he had to say. All the people in the synagogue were so furious, they heard this. They got up, drove him out of town. I've preached a lot of sermons, and I have never had people be furious with me. And maybe I'm not doing it right. Maybe that's something I have to learn yet. But they were furious. This is how the sermon ended. They were furious with him, and when they heard this, they got up and drove him out of town and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. They were going to stone him. This is how you stone people. You take somebody, you drag them out, you set them on a cliff, you declare his offense, somebody supports that, you pick up a rock, you push him off the cliff, and everybody throws the rock at him. If he survives, you must have been wrong. If he doesn't, you were right. They drove him out with the intent to stone him. And we really don't have any more information than this, but I've heard speculation say this. That, these were religious people. I mean, these are people that thought they had it right. They were sincere. They might have been wrong, but they were sincere. They drove him out to stone him. They got him on the precipice. They all picked up their stone, and they waited for someone to make the accusation that would get him. Somebody had to make the accusation, and then somebody had to support the accusation, and then they could push him off the cliff and throw stones at him. And I think Jesus, this is how I see it in my mind. I think Jesus just kind of stood there with this incredible void behind him and waited for someone to make the accusation. No one did. And Jesus dropped his hands and walked through the crowd. It has always been God's plan to reach every tongue and every tribe and every nation. This is where the Israelites had it wrong. They thought they were it. They thought everything stopped with them. They missed the part of God's great plan that they were being placed in the center of the known world so that they could bring the good news of God's kingdom to the whole world. But somehow they thought it just applied to them. Genesis chapter 12. This is God's call to Abram, who will become Abraham. God says to him, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And I showed you a picture, a partial picture of Israel, and that's the land that Abraham was supposed to settle in. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you." Abraham, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to multiply until you are a great nation, and I'm going to bless you. "I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So I'm gonna make you famous, dude. And your fame is going to carry influence that will have a positive impact on everyone that you touch. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And this is the part that tells us what God's mission is. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. Friends, this is what the Israelites had missed. And this is what Jesus is telling them in this itty-bitty sermon that he preached. Elijah had it right. Elisha had it right. We're blessed to be a blessing. We're not blessed to hold a blessing. We're blessed to be a blessing. The Israelites missed the point that they were called to be friends to all people. A friend cares about their neighbors, right? Friend shares with their neighbors, right? A friend protects neighbors. See, we fall into the same kind of thinking. We fall into the same kind of thinking that I'm going to protect what's mine. I had a conversation with a guy the other day about what would happen if somebody pulled the plug on our electrical infrastructure. And his first response to me was, I hope you have a gun. And I looked at him and I said, what good is a gun going to do me? I mean, I might be able to stop someone from coming into my home, but how long am I going to be able to stop them for? How long is my stuff going to hold out? See, what happens to one happens to all. One of the churches that I pastored was in a community a lot like Danville. And we were in the suburbs. My church was in the suburbs. And I had friends that were inner city. And things repeat themselves, right? So this was back in the late 1990s. And there was a casino proposed to move into the community, or they were trying to get a casino in the community. And the folks from the inner city were direly opposed to it. And we had conversations, why are you opposed to it? And they said, well, it is our people this is going to affect most. You know, it's the poor people that are going to spend their grocery money at the casino trying to get big. These are the people it's going to impact. And it's going to impact them and their children, and it's going to be a load on social services, and it's going to snowball. And I can remember one friend, this one friend looking at me and say, and don't fool yourself, because what happens here is going to impact you. You may not be in the city where you feel it, but it'll impact you as well. This is what the Israelites didn't understand, is what happened around them was going to influence them as well. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's mission to all tribes, tongues, and nations. When Jesus said he is the Jubilee, it means he has satisfied the debts. He has restored the slaves. Think about that for each one of us. For each one of us. Jesus, there is nothing that we add to the sacrifice of Jesus that does anything to help free people or deliver people or satisfy the sin debt. Jesus, the old hymn, Jesus paid it all. Jesus paid it all. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's mission to every people, tribe, and tongue. As Jesus followers, it is our role to spread the good news to the poor. It is our role to work to release the captive, heal the crippled, come near the disenfranchised. That's our role. If Jesus fulfilled God's mission, then our role as Jesus followers is help to see that mission worked out. Is it not? Our abundance is provided to bring relief to those in distress. See, we talked earlier about this idea of fairness. God isn't concerned about equality. God is concerned with sufficiency. God isn't concerned. He's never made all people equal. He's never made all circumstances the same. There's always been some that have had less and some that have more. And God, for whatever reason, God does that. I think it's perhaps so that we recognize we need one another. God does that not so that one can have an abundance and be comfortable in it, but he does it so that those that have an abundance will take that abundance and help distribute it, help utilize it to ease the suffering of others. God isn't concerned about equality. God is concerned about sufficiency. There's an example of this in the New Testament. If you will remember, the day of Pentecost, all of these folks had come to Jerusalem for this festival of Pentecost. And when they had come to this festival, they had come prepared to stay for a certain amount of time. And I'm sure that when they came prepared to stay for a certain amount of time, it means it was like us going on a trip. You take the right amount of clothes, you take the right amount of provisions, you take the right amount of money, and you go and you spend it on your vacation, and then you go home. Well, these people had come to Jerusalem for this festival. I'm sure that they brought everything that they thought they were going to need. The thing of it is, God showed up, the Holy Spirit descended upon folks, and they determined that they were going to stick around and learn from these disciples. So what started off as maybe a week in Jerusalem turned into a month in Jerusalem, or maybe 2 months in Jerusalem, or maybe 3 months in Jerusalem. And there was a time where all of the stuff that they had in this journey ran out. And what were they to do? Well, the people of Jerusalem sold everything they had and brought the money and left it at the disciples' feet. I say the people of Jerusalem. The new Christians of Jerusalem sold everything they had, they brought the money, they put it at the disciples' feet, and the disciples used that to distribute food and what was needed among the people that were there. And then Saul came along, and dispersed them, and everybody took what they learned, and they went home, and they started telling people about this Messiah Jesus who had forgiven their sin and set them free. Now, sometime later, a famine invaded Jerusalem. And people that would have had resources to survive a famine couldn't, because they had utilized their resources to take care of the people that had unexpectedly stayed in Jerusalem. So by this time, Saul, had become Paul and was beginning to circulate among churches. And when churches heard that there was a problem in Jerusalem, they remembered when the people of Jerusalem had taken care of them when they had nothing, and they took what they had and they took up an offering so that they could take it, give it to Paul, and Paul could take it to Jerusalem to help ease the suffering of those people. that we're in the midst of a famine. See, God isn't concerned about equality as much as he's concerned about sufficiency. We live in an abundant time. I cannot remember the last time that I missed a meal without choosing to miss a meal. I can't remember the last time I sat in the rain without choosing to sit in the rain. Or the last time I slept on the ground without choosing to sleep on the ground. I mean, we got it pretty good. Even the poorest among us have it pretty good. Got an iPhone. Data minutes. We have an abundance that we have an ability to share with those people that don't. The people of Nazareth took pride in their position in God. I mean, this was a big deal for them. Like I say, they were religious people. They took pride in the position that they had with God because they felt God had specifically chosen them, which God had. The people of Nazareth missed the importance of the mission of God because there was an abundance on them, not simply that they be blessed, but there was an abundance on them that they be a blessing. As followers of Jesus Christ, will we be complacent in our position with Christ? Will we be just comfortable? Will we be satisfied with our salvation? And for those of you that may not have yet received Christ, I'd ask you to consider what he has to offer. He tells us the debt has been paid. We no longer have to bear guilt. And the slave has been released. We no longer have to be bound by those things that diminish us as people. The solution to that is simply receiving Christ as he comes to you. But it doesn't stop there. Too many of us believe that salvation is the end of our spiritual experience. But salvation is simply the beginning of our spiritual experience. It's where it starts. Will we, the followers of Jesus Christ, be people God can work with to complete his mission, which is true social justice? That's our call this morning. That's our challenge. So I'm through preaching. I thought I would get applause, but no. I'm through preaching, but I don't believe God's through working. And if God's working with you, in a minute, Robbie's going to lead us, and the praise band is going to lead us in a song and show us the announcements and tell us we can go. And that's good because, Robbie's planned so much stuff. And when he gets to the end of that plan, I'm glad when he gets to the end of that plan, he says, all right, I'm done. But just because the preaching's finished and just because the music is finished and just because the announcements have run doesn't mean God's done. And if God's speaking to you this morning, I would encourage you, don't rush that. Don't cut that off. Don't say, oh, they told me it's time to leave, so I have to leave. But if God's speaking to you this morning, if you need to speak to somebody, there are those of us around that you can approach. You can approach myself or Dennis or Any other individual business over here that you might perceive as being somebody you could talk to? Maybe you just want to hear what God has to say, and He's speaking to you right now, right where you are, and you feel as though if you do much, you're going to disrupt that. I encourage you just to sit there. And I don't care how long you sit there. You know, if we lock up the building around you, there's a push bar that you can get out. So you won't be hemmed in until next week, unless you and God decide to be hemmed in by next week. But I encourage you, don't let this moment pass. If God is speaking to you, this is a holy moment. And I want you to embrace it and allow God to do the work in you that only He can do. I'm going to pray for you. Father, we thank you for